Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about a Total War Saga Troy and Total War Pharaoh, and why I think a Total War Saga Troy is the better game, and was the better game even from launch. I'm not gonna mince words on this. Some people might argue that, oh, Troy wasn't that great of a game when it launched. It certainly did have issues, but oh, it was the DLCs, it was the patches that improved it. They did, but the base game of Troy is a better game than Pharaoh is in multiple ways. There are things that Pharaoh does better. The way it handles the growth system of settlements, the way it handles difficulty, the way it handles many systems on the campaign map, in terms of balance at the very least, is better. The way the situation is between the various faction rulers and Pharaoh, as opposed to how things are in Troy, where there's a severe imbalance between the Achaeans and the Trojans that heavily favors the Trojans, because as the Trojans you got Daddy Priam in Troy who will give you a ton of resources for nothing, and you can easily take advantage of that, and you have a better terrain to capture in the campaign, whereas the Achaeans are stuck dealing with the Peloponnese and all the issues that are taking place over there, and also a lot of naval battles potentially as well. And a game that doesn't have naval battles, which is one of the problems that we do see there. So there are things that Pharaoh does better, but there are many other things that Troy does better. Now, some people would argue, well, agents, not having agents in Pharaoh does let it down. I don't think agents are really that great of a feature, but certainly not having heroes that you can attach to armies as you do in Warhammer 3 is the downside. And not having those kind of special characters, you just have generals. So it's kind of a letdown in that respect. Removing agents, okay, but not replacing them with anything else, that is certainly a downside as I see it. It just feels like Pharaoh is a far more limited game. Like, you see what they removed over there. And then there's other things as well that Troy just does better. The way resources generally work in this game, as opposed to the way they work in Pharaoh. So in Troy, you will just be able to get more resources than you will be able to do so in Pharaoh. That's largely because the main settlement building in a resource element will generate some resources. It's not because individual buildings will generate more resources, because you have one more buildings in a settlement that generate resources, which you don't have in Pharaoh, with the exception of food, and only with the exception of the Nile. Maybe there's a couple of things faction specific, but for the most part, resources are far more limited than Pharaoh. So you end up in a campaign situation where everything's slower and just feels artificially slower. Like, they deliberately slowed things down in that particular campaign just because they knew, I have the theory, they knew they didn't really have a lot going for it, and so they deliberately decided to slow things down. There are things better, like diplomacy, all that. There are improvements in that respect, yes, absolutely so, but there's also there's also issues with the way they decided to handle Pharaoh. The bigger issue, though, isn't about resources, it's not about the limited campaign, is that the campaigns themselves feel far less unique than they do in Troy. So let's consider one aspect in Troy. When you start a campaign, each hero will have a bunch of Homeric characters that are attached to them. You may not use these guys, but these are immortal heroes that can't die, immortal generals from the very beginning, because they're Homeric characters that each and every single faction leader will have in their campaigns from the start, with the exception of maybe a couple, but for the most part, especially of the base game lords, they will have heroes attached to them. Now, don't get me wrong, like the supply line situation, the way they changed supply lines to administration was certainly a welcome change, but because it allowed you to, use more of these heroes, even if they didn't have an army. But the fact you had a roster of heroes unique to every single faction ruler did add variety to a campaign. That's just one thing. And the way the that heroes were handled, the way generals were handled, typically was better. Like, you had this uniqueness with generals because they had a different level of motivation, and how you improve that motivation in the campaign. Sure, it could be annoying, and it made certain heroes far better than others. Melee heroes, like certain heroes that had access to certain abilities, were just far superior to others, while at certain hero classes. Okay, that's true. So that was a balance issue, but the intent behind how things worked in Troy was substantially better than just the generic one-size-fits-all generals that we get in Pharaoh. And we're just talking here generals. We're just talking here the aspect of generals and how they could make campaigns feel unique. That's not even touching on the unique campaign mechanics that every single ruler, every single legendary lore faction ruler had in Troy. So take into consideration Achilles. He has beyond the starting position, which starts over here in Phia. Beyond the fact that he's the one closest to Troy, so he will certainly feel the full wrath of Troy, the earliest in a campaign, which he can deal with. Beyond that particular situation, Achilles doesn't play like any other faction ruler in the game. Yes, he's still Greek. Yes, he has a unit roster that he shares, like the native units you would have there. But there's certainly a good amount of uniqueness. And this is in the base game, not considering mythos when we're talking about that. So let's look at Achilles and the way the things that he has in his campaign. So first off, Achilles gets significant faction benefits, minus 20% upkeep costs. He gets extra units that you can global recruit, and he gets influence faction-wide if he defeats the challengers that stand against him, because Achilles is this great hero who cannot be defeated. So sometimes, like, you'll start with a set of challengers, other challengers will arise to challenge you, but when you do defeat them, you will get in these benefits, and they are pretty substantial benefits that you can get in a campaign through special recruitment. So that's one of the uniqueness of Achilles. The other unique element of Achilles in his campaign is his mood swings, because he throws temper tantrums. So if you're keeping him garrisoned, you will gain more resources and happiness, resource faction-wide, happiness province-wide, but you'll lose influence and you'll lose a lot in terms of the evaluation. But this is the game telling you not to do it. Like, you want to keep Achilles fighting. But then you've got grieving, because he's going to lose, he's going to gain favor of the gods, experience to all units in his army, favor from priestesses rituals, but he's going to lose 7 happiness faction-wide. And then the great thing is you get white hot rage. So if he spends a lot of turns in battle, he will get aggressive. He'll gain melee attack, 100% post-battle loot, 10% casualty replenishment, 25% damage to all units, 100% income from looting and sacking settlements from armies faction-wide. You'll lose 30% resources faction-wide, but you'll gain so much money from looting and sacking settlements that it will not matter. So you can really sustain an Achilles campaign in a way you can't sustain any other campaign. Yes, you do suffer in terms of growth in your campaign as a result of that. That's the trade-off. Or you can keep them balanced if you do decide to do that. That can work. Or you can just really take advantage of that situation in terms of post-battle loot and make him an extremely powerful faction on the campaign map. Now, I emphasize, Troy has its major issues. Someone put it, you're comparing one bad game to another. I am. I mean, Troy is not a great game. It has issues. There's a lot of great things Troy has as ideas, especially on the campaign map. The execution of things is not that great. The battles in Troy are not that great. My hope had been with Pharaoh that what they were going to do was they were going to take a look at all the things they did wrong in Troy, take a look at things they did well in Troy, and look to improve in every way possible. They didn't. They reduced the uniqueness of each individual campaign, because, like, Achilles' mechanics are not shared with any other faction. Odysseus, who's, his faction is right next to me right now in territory, he can take land-based settlements, but he's not really going to benefit from them. He has naval supremacy. Odysseus, when controlled by the AI, kind of like acts as the Achaean version of Prime. He's going to have a significant cache of resources that he might be willing to to trade as well. And by the way, like this campaign, interestingly enough, like look at this is a campaign turn 79. Odysseus has managed to accomplish quite a bit during the course of this particular campaign. But then again, so have I, really. Like Achilles is a selfish bastard that fights on his own, basically. That's my point. So the uniqueness of each individual campaign is lacking. But here's another part where the game is severely lacking when it compared to where Pharaoh is severely lacking compared to Troy. Battles. And it's not because battles are somehow better in Troy. Battles are not better in Troy. They still have the issue where the heaviest armored units will win out against the more lightly units. This is an issue that was in Troy, got carried over in Pharaoh. It was a major issue there. It's still a major issue over here. That hasn't changed. But here's the thing. Here's the critical difference. In Troy, you had more ways of customizing our army than you did in Pharaoh. And you had a way in every campaign of making that making an army variety actually work. Not because magically lighter infantry would work better. No. But the way the way things could work, if I can find an army to showcase that, if I have any army to do so. Actually, let's just go with generals. But the way you could customize each faction is through myth units. So while myth units were kind of a gimmick in a lot of ways, the myth units did add a genuine sense of variety to a campaign. Because while giants, for instance, have low armor, they're monster units, effectively, as you'd see in Warhammer 3. So they're monster units. I mean, it is still lesser than what we get in Warhammer 3, but it's better than what we got in Pharaoh, because these kind of units did add a genuine sense of variety to a campaign. And this was available by default in the Truth Behind the Myth mod. It wasn't great, the way they decided to handle it, but it did work. It did add the genuine sense of variety in a campaign. And I might also add that in this particular situation, I'm using a lot of spearmen, and that also works surprisingly much better than you might think over here in a campaign. And whereas in something like Pharaoh, I would want to get as many axemen and clubmen as possible in a campaign as quickly as possible to really contest the heavy armor of enemy units. Like, look at what I've accomplished over here in this campaign with the units that I'm actually using. This has been a more fun campaign for me to play, and I played it like months ago. This was far more fun to play than any of the campaigns I managed to play in Pharaoh, because the unit variety I would get, the unit variety I'd actually use, the myth unit variety, etc., that was better. Then we got to talk a bit about the gods as well, because while it was always like imbalanced with the gods in Troy, instead of improving the balance, giving you more reasons to focus on other gods than just going with Aphrodite, they just said, oh no, you can only focus on 3 gods at most. They limited that in a campaign, instead of giving you that greater variety and giving you more reasons as opposed to just making one god overpowered versus others. They kind of toned it down, made it less meaningful, and just limited how many gods you could use. That's one of the reasons, like, among many other reasons, why Troy is the better game than Pharaoh. And Troy was available for free. Pharaoh is $60. You understand that. Like, they're asking more for a game that's lesser in virtually every single way that counts. The battles are less interesting because you take away the myth units. You don't fix anything in terms of the imbalance issues, like heavy units with a lot of armor piercing dominating battles, or just heavy units in general dominating the battles. They don't fix anything with respect to that. In some ways, they make that worse. Because, like, you can play with a lot of light units. You just got to understand they don't have the durability to go against heavy units. But, like, skirmishers are useful. Funnily enough, light infantry, like lighter units that can move faster around the battlefield and do flanking maneuvers, are actually feel far more useful in this game than they do there. Because flanking attacks matter more. Chariots matter more. Yes, Troy, for all the discussion that, oh, chariots were terrible, chariots are far better in this game to use, at least at the moment, than they were in Troy, than they are in Pharaoh. Sure, they might have been too strong early on, but the way they nerfed them and balanced them was much better. Sure, we're getting into the territory where we start talking about DLC, but yeah, when a new game comes out, you're going to compare it to how the previous game was with DLC, with content. That's a reality. That's what people are going to do. It's not like, oh, we're just going to compare how this was. We will see, we will wonder like, okay, is this going to get better down the line or anything like that? But how it is with DLC, versus the new game is going to matter. So we got to talk about the Mythos units. We got to talk about the unique mechanics of the Mythos units. We got to talk about the Amazons. We can talk about Memnon. We can talk about Rhesus. We can talk about Ajax. We can talk about Diomedes and their own unique playstyles. Not in every way, but in the vast majority of ways, Troy is the superior title. If I was to pick one, if I was to buy one right now to play, I would choose Troy every single day. There are certain things I like in terms of like the surplus points, the happiness influence, the way that plays out in Pharaoh, certainly. The crown system, absolutely. But like as a game, I think Troy is the more memorable, more interesting, better designed game from the start. Not how it ended, because how it ended is vastly superior to how Pharaoh is. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.